SECfans.com, week 12. This one is kind of an interesting week because we got a lot of the bigger teams, or the teams that are really in the hunt right now, taking a week off. They're playing games, but they're taking a week off. So Alabama and Auburn are both falling into that category, both resting up for that Iron Bowl showdown. So we're going to talk about 3 games this week, 2 in the SEC, 1 outside of the SEC. Obviously got Husky Pup in the house again, got a computer model for you. First one we're going to talk about is Florida and LSU, game of the week. And this is an interesting one because it's a makeup game. We've already touched on that in the past. And then we're going to touch on Mississippi State and Arkansas. It's a cool matchup just because of where these teams have gone throughout the year, and kind of how they've progressed. And then we're going to hit on West Virginia and Oklahoma. West Virginia is sort of that forgotten team in the mix of teams that could challenge, and even Oklahoma sitting right there on the edge of the top 10 for challenging for one of those playoff spots. So we're going to discuss that game and just kind of what it means in the broader college football landscape, and maybe it might not mean much at all given how little love the Big 12 has gotten this year, and I think that's deserving, and we'll get into that. So first game, LSU, Florida. This is the makeup game that was sort of a weird one because we don't really know what happened. Did LSU, did Florida, who was the one that kind of pushed to not have the game, and then did the SEC force them to play? I have a feeling that if they didn't force them, we wouldn't see this game happening. So it's interesting because it impacts the race, especially in the East. Alabama's already sewn up the West, but this is a big game for LSU too. They got a huge win over Arkansas last weekend, and I think they're wanting to put a good end point on their season, especially in their regular season and then going to the bowls. We don't know what their coaching situation is going to be, but they've got a lot of momentum even with the loss to Alabama. So let's get started on this one. What do you think? LSU and Florida, take it away.
LSU and Florida is obviously a game we've been looking forward to for much of the season. Two of the conference's better defense. They both play sound against the pass, sound against the run. I would argue that LSU isn't necessarily so much better defensively than Florida, as much as they are just more consistent. Florida has at times, be it the Arkansas game, the Tennessee game, really struggled to put together solid, consistent performances. But in a per play sense, Florida's actually given up less yardage, about 4.3 yards per play, than LSU at 4.6. Both of those are in a pretty good gap from Georgia at 5, and right, not all that far behind Alabama at giving up only 4 yards per play. So if you want to say the issue for these two teams, it's whether they can move the football, right? I mean, there's no question that both of these teams can, stop the other when it comes to the run, and whether, it's going to be a grind out game. But there's also no question of the fact that neither one of these quarterbacks has been anywhere near as effective as you would like to see. So, just sort of breaking things down a little bit, when you look at the model, in terms of per play averages allowed by both teams, the first thing that stands out to me is how weak really Florida's schedule was. And don't cut me off right there, because it's not such a drag on Florida. Their stats are going to end up looking really good. But the trick is, they played 5 teams that average less than 4 yards per carry. That's atrocious. For a national average to be under 4 yards per carry, I mean, just sort of put that in comparison. Those teams are all, at least 96th or worse, all bottom 100, and their opponent average on the season is only 3.97 yards per carry. So if you want to sort of peg that where that's at nationally, that's between Southern Miss and Duke. That is the average rushing game that Florida has faced. Now, their statistics are phenomenal. They're only giving up 3.1 yards per carry. That's 78% of opponent averages. But one of the things I think that's interesting is that the teams they played are so bad that it's hard to say, right? On one hand, you want to say, well, that 78% is even more impressive because once the average gets that low, like when Alabama completely, utterly shuts down LSU, they still give up 2.5 yards per carry. It's darn hard to get below those numbers against any sort of competent offense. Simply because the guy when he hits the line of scrimmage is still going to fall forward for a yard and a half most of the time. So that's about as dominant as you can get. But on the other hand, something we talk about a lot is how when an offense ceases to be able to run for about 4.5 yards per carry, the offense tends to shut down on the run game. Florida's played several teams this year. In fact, most of the teams they've played, the only exception is really Kentucky. Everybody else is at 4.5 or less that cannot sustain a game running the football. And that means, when they play Florida, who is a good run defense, they can't really play Florida straight up. They can't lean on the run. They're not going to really try to establish it because if they try to run the ball, frequently, they're gonna stall. So I think that was the first major thing that jumped out at me when I was running these numbers is that Florida's run defense very good, 78%. That's what I would call elite. But the flip side is that their average opponent is something like 90th in the country in rush defense. LSU, their rush defense numbers are frankly gaudy. I mean, they're giving up only 3.1 yards per carry. It's the same as Florida, but their opponents average over a half a yard a carry more, about 0.6 of a carry more. And again, to sort of put that in comparison, it's like the jump between Southern Miss and Duke I talked about earlier in the 90s. Now we're getting up more to like North Carolina, California, not good teams that really even still that LSU's played, but a heck of a lot better than Florida. And so their rush numbers are, percentages higher than Florida, but again, they're giving up the same yard per carry total, just better defense or better offenses that LSU's played. And that either means that what LSU's done is more impressive, is one way to look at it, or LSU's just had the ability to limit opponents to less yardage. Okay, moving on quickly to the pass, same story. Florida giving up 6 yards per attempt, LSU giving up 6.2. But again, Florida's average opponent is only getting 6.8 yards per attempt, and LSU is their opponent's average about on average about a yard per attempt more at 7.6. So again, the story is LSU is better because even though they hold opponents to the same average, LSU's average opponent actually decent. They're 7.6 yards per attempt. That's Baylor. That's Houston. That's Ohio State. That's at that level, about between 40 to 50th in the country. Where again, Florida's opponents 6.8 yards per attempt is dreadful. That's all the way down in the 80s and 90s. At this point, we're talking about Maryland and Minnesota and Marshall and South Carolina. South Carolina is actually better than the average Florida opponent. So, again, very good pass defense by Florida in theory, but their opponents have been so terrible. Here, there's a little bit of a difference. Florida's 88% of opponent averages, LSU 82. Again, anything below 85, I start classifying as elite. Florida is only really, in my opinion, good. 88, 87% is just merely good. And that's because their opponent passing games, in large part playing due to playing in the East, but also because, their non-conference opponents are UMass, who's one of the worst in the country, North Texas, who is one of the 10 worst in the country. And that really has drugged down their averages and greatly inflated Florida's pass defense numbers. And I guess, yeah, to finish it off, since I've already delved into the model real quick before Daniel gets a chance to jump back in and ask me something that's a little more interesting and a little less nerdy. The question is, where does that end up with the model and scoring? And this is interesting, right? That Florida should average, pretty measly 4.2 yards per play, and that's that's rough, right? Florida has averaged better than that on almost every game. The only one that was really close was the Georgia game, where they managed to win 24-10 despite, having almost no offensive production. Other than that, this is worse than they would be in UMass. Unsurprising, right? I mean, this is a very good LSU defense. But LSU, compared to the 4.2 for Florida, LSU should average about 5.6 yards per play. That's actually pretty respectable. And you would think from that, again, yard and a half per play average advantage over Florida, that LSU would be favored to win the game. Yet again, just like Alabama, they're not. And the reason is LSU is so one dimensional, so dependent on the ability to sustain drives running the football, that their point production for the yardage is awful. When they have 5 to 6 yards per play, they're averaging between 13 and 20 points. And if they drop below 5.5, it's questionable whether they're going to get 2 touchdowns, right? Our only real evidence of them having less than 5 yards per play is Alabama, and they didn't score and didn't generate any offense, really. So when you have to run the ball every play to have any success, and when your passing game is totally predicated on the run, what you end up with is, you either run the ball 3 times and you get a first down, or you run the ball 3 times you run the ball 3 times for 5 yards each, you get a first down. Manage 4.5, still get a first down. But if you manage less than 4, you go 3 and out and you punt. And if they have to pass in an obvious passing situation, I don't think they're going to have much success for Florida. And that's why, in this case, the model actually has Florida an 18-10 winner over LSU, even though LSU has a pretty significant per play advantage, basically saying LSU in a given play will be more successful than Florida, but LSU will have a lot of drives, probably all game, much like Alabama. They get stranded anytime they have any success. They're not going to be able to capitalize on opportunities. And Florida, for all their limited production, much like the Georgia game, and that's where the model is really drawing this from, should be able to generate some points. They've been able to do that for most of this year, and that's why the model has Florida 18-10 over LSU.
And obviously, I think both of us are probably going to disagree with the model. I don't know exactly where you're leaning on that, but I think it's so hard to put a hard number metric and model against a team that has played such an abysmal schedule. It's almost like, you're feeding it the kind of data that just breaks it. Like, you just can't do it, especially when LSU not only has played an SEC West schedule, but also played Wisconsin to start the season. So my thoughts on Florida are that they haven't played anyone who does anything well. I think the best you could say is that they played an Arkansas team that, when they get hot, can throw the ball. But in that game, it was really more Raleigh Williams running the ball, and not necessarily. I mean, Austin Allen had a good game, but he didn't go off. He didn't do a 450 yards, 4 touchdowns kind of thing. So I think Florida's numbers have to be looked at in the context of they have some good numbers against teams who are bad at everything they do. LSU, on the other hand, is really, really good at 2 things: defense and running the ball. And another one-dimensional, but I can't say that their pass offense is any worse than what looks like now to be the Austin Appleby show. So we're going to see which Purdue quarterback can do better, but I don't see Florida doing anything offensively even good. So they don't run it, they don't throw it, they especially don't do these things against good defenses. For that reason, I do think it's going to be a low scoring game, but I think LSU probably wins by 10 points.
I don't disagree. And the reason is a little simple. We've talked about a lot that, in my opinion, to have success with any sort of big boy football offense, you have to have 4.5 yards per play. If you want to have a consistent production, or at least per rush, I should say, you need to have 4.5 yards per carry. And that gives you balance. That gives you the ability to run the ball, importantly, to sustain drives, because some rushes are going to be stuffed to the line of scrimmage for a yard or two. Some are going to be negative plays. If you have 4.5 yards per carry, that means on 2 carries, I get 9 yards. And on the third, maybe it's the aberration, so I only get 1. I still get a first down. The moment you drop down to 4 or less, you start to see issues where, you run the ball well for 4 yards, run the ball well for 4 yards, and now you're in 3rd and 2, and you're only running it for 4 yards in a good play. So when you have to run for the 2, you can't get it, and you end up struggling a little bit. And you see this all the time, right? Teams are trying to grind it out, and they get these 3rd and 2 situations, trying to drive down the field, and they throw a pass, it doesn't make it, or the guy runs a sweep, doesn't make it, and it's because they just they're struggling to begin with, and in these obvious run situations are not successful, and they're constantly in just a little bit further than they need to be. Florida has, again, they've only played 3 teams that could average all season. 3 teams that are averaging 4.5 yards per play. It's baffling in the SEC that can even happen. But those 3 teams, like you said, who are they? They're Tennessee, Missouri, and Kentucky. And all the rest couldn't even do that. But of those 3, Missouri, um, that one's kind of a head scratcher. They run the ball fairly well. The defense is atrocious. Um, Tennessee, again, Tennessee beat them with, yeah. And the other one is Kentucky, and that's in some ways Florida's best win. But, what's the issue with Kentucky? Kentucky imploded in that football game, right? They completed 3 passes and they threw 3 interceptions. So they were so bad passing the ball. They only threw 14 passes in the ball game that they were rendered completely one-dimensional, and Florida could shut down the run. Like you said, maybe the only balanced team they really played was Tennessee, and they lost badly on a pretty embarrassing second half blowout. The only other one I would argue, probably Arkansas. It's a little early still, but it seems pretty clear Arkansas is a different team running the football since their bye week. They've totally woken up on that side of the football for whatever reason. Maybe some of it's defensively, but they can also throw it pretty well. And again, Florida just got embarrassed against Arkansas. So what I'm seeing is Florida, for all their stats, like we talk about, they happen to have played teams that struggle enough that when Florida could kind of clamp down on them, the other team's offenses just implode because the other team's offenses are imploding in most of the games they play. Florida, when they've played a team that can do something pretty well, has struggled a number of times. Arkansas throwing the ball. Again, Kentucky was thrown out. But, the flip side to this is Florida really hasn't struggled with teams that run it well. They struggle with teams that throw it well. But even still, that makes me skeptical to pick Florida. LSU may not be a great passing team. I don't think they are, but I think they're a very good running team. I said something really crazy several weeks ago where I said that, looking at the stats, there was a serious argument that Geis was actually a better tailback than Leonard Fournette. Now, I don't think that's true across the board. I think Leonard Fournette has been hampered by his ankle injury pretty significantly all year. But I think at this point, I think it's a mistake. And once Fournette came back, we keep harping in the Alabama game, but it's kind of a defining game. We're going to get to that in a second for LSU. But I think it was a serious mistake that LSU hasn't made the point to get Geis the ball more because he's been incredibly productive. And so, I just feel like LSU, if they stick to their guns at what they're good at, try to establish the run, I question whether Florida is going to be able to handle a team that can actually sustain drives running the football. Because the only teams really, again, that were able to sustain drives were Tennessee and Arkansas. Both of them got up pretty good. And if they can do that, Florida will, LSU can run away to a little bit of a point margin of victory. And on the other side, even if LSU can't, I don't see any evidence that Florida is going to be able to move the ball on LSU. I have them averaging less than 4.2 yards, 4.2 yards per play. Again, I'm talking about 4.5 yards per rush to run the ball. Your passing averages need to be really high because, you're only going to complete every other one. So if you have 5 yards per attempt or 6 yards per attempt, say 6 yards per attempt may be great, which means, maybe, but if you only complete 50% of them, every other one goes for, what it means is one will go for 30 yards and then one will go for 3 and one will go for 0. So you run the ball on first down and then you get a 30-yard pass and then you run the ball on first down and then you get a 0 and a 3 and you punt. So your passing averages have to be quite high. Florida's offense in this game is predicted to be so low that it can't move the ball. For that reason, I have a hard time picking against LSU in this ball game. There's a reason for me to think LSU is going to have some offensive success. I don't have any real reason to think Florida can have offensive success, and so I'm going to pick LSU.
I, and I don't think it's a shock. The kind of the temperature, if you're taking of everybody who talks about this game, they feel like LSU's gonna win it. The thing that kind of sticks out to me is LSU gave up 21 to Ole Miss, but 7 of that was from a red zone turnover, I think on like the 4-yard line. And besides that game and the 20 points they gave to Miss State, which was all fourth quarter, it was a blowout. They put a couple on late. So really, if you take that into account, they've not given up 20 any other game this year, including Alabama. I don't see Florida scoring more than, like, if I'm being charitable, 13, 17. And by the way, y'all, that beeping happens every week. My battery dies all the time. It happens exactly when I'm talking. So I'm not cooking food in a microwave. It's just my camera. Anyway, so I just don't see them scoring enough. And you said that Florida struggles with teams that throw it, but they haven't played. I don't know that they've played a good rushing team this year, much less a team that's elite on that side of the ball. And to your point about Geis, they did get him involved, really involved against Arkansas. I think he had like 252 yards to Fournette's like 60 or something, or 90. It was considerably more. I forget the box score. So I agree with you, man. I'll be shocked if Florida wins this game, but it's hard to completely count out a team when they are good defensively and they're playing a team that's one-dimensional on offense.
Yeah, and something we have to point out is there's a real weirdness in the model, and that's that, as we said, LSU's actually been successful in basically every game this year. They're averaging over 5 yards per play in every game, but one. They averaged under 3 yards per play against Alabama. And one of the interesting things is this is a normal distribution curve model, meaning it's trying to graph a polynomial to be really nerdy, basically trying to put a trend line on the graph. It's not a straight line that we're graphing, but it's trying to say, predict a point total based off the yard per play production. Alabama was such an outlier, or such, basically the model has nothing to really know what LSU will do when it drops below 5 yards per play, other than Alabama. And against Alabama, they were dismal and they didn't score any points. So that Alabama game in the model is a flippin' rock. It's an anchor that's killing LSU's point totals. We went in and, it's a rough surgery, but I went in and cut out the Alabama game as best as I could from the model to see how much of an effect it is. With the Alabama game taken into account, the model predicts Florida to win 18-10. But if we take the Alabama game out, it predicts an 18-18 tie. So, in the background, it sounds like my colleague here is probably face first on the ground trying to change a battery. Sounds like he tripped. But the end result here is that Alabama game, if it's an aberration, if that really was something where Alabama is just that good and we can't take anything from it, the model actually says these are evenly matched teams. And you can even make an argument that LSU should be better. The problem is the model takes every game into account, and it says when LSU really struggles, they really struggle. And that is really why it has Florida winning in a low scoring game. But I personally think the Alabama game is that much of an aberration. I think their defense is just kind of at a bit of a different level. Again, like we said, Florida's defense is really, really good, but playing against really bad offenses. Alabama's is even better, but they've played much better offenses than Florida. So I think the 18-18 prediction without the Alabama game is probably a lot more accurate. And that gives me a lot more that fact pattern, knowing that when you take Alabama out, it starts pushing way more to LSU fast. Again, doubles LSU's production if we ignore the Alabama game. I think that gives me some confidence to pick LSU in a 20-10 win.
Okay, so 20-10. Just for fun, give me a yard per carry and total yardage number for Leonard Fournette and for guys.
You like to be cruel with these random questions out of nowhere. I hmm, I think Fournette probably gets fewer carries, and I think he's going to end up with a really good average, something like 8.5 yards per carry on. Well, it's interesting because can I hedge? Am I allowed to hedge a little bit? Whoever leads LSU in rushing is going to average. I'm going to say 4.4 yards per carry, be it Fournette or Geis. Whoever the reserve back is, and I think it's going to be about a 2-1 or 3-1 split based off what LSU's done through the season, their trends. The reserve back's going to have something like a 6.5 to 8.5 yard per carry average, where he's going to break a few big plays that are going to really boost his total. Um, and so, yeah, and I think my gut is after last week, they're going to give a lot of touches to Geis because they know Fournette is probably a little more hampered than they've been giving him credit for. Let Geis pound away for 4.4 per, and then put Fournette in, who's going to hit a couple big home runs where he just, they let him explode through the hole on what will probably be a tired Florida defense. But, if they flip the script, I think you actually see a pretty similar scenario where Fournette's the one pounding every play, and then they put in Geis. Geis will end up with like 6.5 yards per carry. So yeah, well, I'm not even hedging anymore. I'm saying if Fournette's the leading rusher or Geis, either one will have 4.4 per. And if Fournette is the reserve guy, you're going to see like 8.5 per in reserve. If Geis is the reserve guy, you'll see like 6.5 per in reserve.
All right, I think that was a perfectly fair hedge, even though it wasn't that much of one. Last question on this game. I think it's an interesting one. I know we don't really do total yards here, but give me a total yardage rushing number for LSU that if they don't hit, they lose the game.
Now that's a tough one. So rushing total that they need to hit in order to win the football game. I'm gonna say 125.
You think if they hit 125, they win the game? See, I think they got to hit like 250.
Now I think it's lower. They hit. Let me pull this up. See if my brain's right here. I think that's about what they hit at Wisconsin. Yeah, actually, Wisconsin they had 126 yards. They scored 14 points.
They scored 7
I think
points because they had a pick six.
okay, fair enough. But I don't think that's too crazy. I think if they have that much yardage total, I have very, very little confidence in Florida's ability to score points. Let me be clear.
Okay.
Very little. And so I think they just need enough. It's a lot like Georgia Auburn. They need to put up like 13 points in this ball game, and they can hang on and win. Um, if they can't put up 125, though, they're not going to be able to put up 10 points. I mean,
Right.
they're not going to put up anything. So if you would say what they have to hit to win, it's 125. Now, if your question is what do they hit, what's the yardage total they need to hit to just win, period, I think you're right. If they hit 250, they win the game. Done. If it,
This game is interesting because it starts to get into the territory that you and I have talked about so much this year of the wackiness as the scores approach zero and the variability therein when you're talking about a 7-10, 7-13 kind of game where a weird special teams play or a fumble or some short field on the 15-yard line because of a shank punt can completely change the game and tilt it in the favor of somebody who might otherwise be an underdog. So I think I think we're in that territory. What do you think?
no, I agree. I mean, we're definitely in the territory and that's why we're both kind of like,
Yeah,
and having to
yeah.
pick this game, right? Because it's so low that we're trying to say, and it's why the model was so screwy when you had Alabama included and not included. It's saying, well, both these teams are going to be operating on the margin, the margins of what they've been all season, and on the margin of being functional. And when they are just marginally functional, what can either team do? Who's able to actually put points on the board when nothing's working? Both defenses are opportunistic. We've seen Florida the past couple of seasons, Kentucky this year. Was it Missouri game last year where they had like 150 yards of offense and put up 50 points or whatever that crazy game
Right.
was? That it, they've done it, but I think LSU's equally good. And yeah, it's the Auburn Georgia scenario. Georgia beats Auburn 13-7. Of those 13 points Georgia scored, 7 of them were a pick six. So you take that out, that one horrible play by Auburn, and Georgia loses 7-6. And so you go, oh, okay, well, Auburn outplayed Georgia, right? Because Auburn's offense scored, more than Georgia's. Well, actually, no. Georgia had twice as many yards, over twice as many yards as Auburn did. It's just that somehow Auburn actually, that one touchdown, 7 points, came on 164 total yards in the entire ball game.
Right.
And Georgia, with 340 yards, only managed to score 6 offensively, partly due to turnovers and whatnot. The whole point here is when you're that low, Auburn just needed one drive or one play that worked to get 7. Georgia, likewise, was also so low, so they were actually able to drive the field, but they're not able to drive it enough to get there consistently, to get field goals, to get in the end zone. They just drove it well enough to get into field goal range a couple times and put 6 points on the board. And that's why these games tend to be decided. Again, Georgia, despite outgaining Auburn, still needed a pick six because those point plays start mattering more than actual per play production. And that is almost impossible to predict with any consistency.
So it's really I'm interested in this game just to see. I like these weird matchups where it is potentially a low scoring game, maybe a defensive struggle, but then sometimes these games turn out to be some randomly high scoring. I'm obviously going to watch it. It's our game of the week. I'm really interested in it, but there's another game that I picked.
May the best Boilermaker win.
Exactly.